So for me, it started out as let's look at an emotional expression, and now it's taking me through into like how we regulate emotion, the nature of friendship, how we make and maintain social bonds, why it feels good to laugh. All these different things are kind of just take you off in these different directions all the time. In fact, it's interesting if you go back to the first sort of person to study emotion in this way of thinking about it in a sort of scientific way was actually Charles Darwin. And it's really interesting if you go back to his book on the expression of emotions in man and other animals, because he talked a lot about laughter. He thought it really mattered. He thought it was an expression of joy, and he valued it a great deal. And then in the sort of development of experimental psychology and neuroscience over the next 150 years, we picked up a lot of what he talked about with emotion and the fact that it we found in other animals, but it was all for stuff like fear and anger and disgust and sadness. We just ignored what he said about laughter. And it doesn't feel serious. It doesn't feel like it could help you understand sort of clinical conditions. And actually, I think it also reflects, in the West, a great undervaluing of laughter in general. So you see this, people always think that stand-up comedians are just riffing. They are never just riffing. Why would they do that? They have worked up that routine over years and months, and they've absolutely honed it to get the best laugh. It is perfectly put together. Exactly, yeah, exactly. And there is no way they are just going to I'll just riff this one. It's never just pull it out of my hat. It's just somehow easier to imagine that it's easy for them than that they've really worked hard at doing this, because that's serious work.
3, 2, 1. Hello. Welcome to another episode of the Jeoffrey Sarpong podcast. Today I have Professor Sophie Scott. How are you, Professor?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming on the show today. Thanks for your time this afternoon. I got introduced to your work just through like a lot of research. I like to do research into like topics that I've always been fascinated on, and in neuroscience of laughter is a topic that I've never understood. It's this topic I was introduced for the first time through you. So that was very interesting. And so when I saw that, I was like, I have to speak to you. So thank you for your time today. And thank you for agreeing to have this conversation with me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. So one of the first questions that I had when I first listened to your lecture was that I wanted to understand how you got to this point of researching this. So took you back a little bit. So how did you first become interested in the human voice and like the science of laughter? Where did that all stem from?
I when I was doing my undergraduate degree in psychology, I was very interested in the psychology of music, and I wanted to study that, and I had the opportunity to do a PhD, and started a PhD with somebody who'd worked in that area. So how do we process music? And it turned out by the time I joined his lab, his interest had moved much more over into speech. So I did a PhD on speech, but it was around like the sound of speech and the rhythm of speech and what puts rhythm. When you hear a rhythm in somebody's voice, what is it that you're hearing? And really looking at the musical aspects of that. So I was working in speech, but really I was looking at the human voice. And over the next few years, I got interested in like the linguistic information that's happening when you're hearing somebody speak, but also in all the other information that's in there, like emotion. And throughout the kind of late 90s and into the 2000s, I was getting my hands on these brain imaging techniques. So you could actually ask questions about how's the brain processing these sounds, these very complex social sounds that we make when we're speaking. And I started doing more on emotion, and then I just got interested in all the stuff we ever did on emotion. It was always really negative stuff like fear and sadness and anger. And I wanted to know more about, if there are some, is it possible that there are like really meaningful emotions that you might find in all human communities which are largely positive? And other than happiness, which is what people often studied with the face, like a smiling face. And then it turned out this scientist called Paul Ekman had suggested that positive emotions like contentment, pleasure, relief, triumph, and what he called amusement, those could be candidate emotions that, if anything, would be best expressed with the voice. And I thought, great, so I started looking at those as well. And as soon as you start looking at laughter, and of course the amusement sounds were laughter sounds, it just runs away from you. And it was quite unlike all the other emotional sounds, and there was just, when I started to look more generally, there just was so little work into it. that it just I kind of stumbled on it by accident. I never set out to study it. And then we find that it's recognised in all human communities, and it's something that has an older evolutionary history. And so it's got a lot of things that might make you think it's actually what gets called a basic emotional expression, something that you find in all, kind of universal to humans and isn't restricted to humans, and which has a very kind of common ways that it's expressed and understood. So that's really how I ended up just doing more and more work on laughter.
That's so fascinating. I think that's like the journey from like how obviously it starts with me and the understanding the music and voice and goes into amusement and like narrowing down on laughter. It's such a fascinating thing to me. I think what I also wanted to know was like at the beginning of that curiosity, when you found laughter from the amusement, what did I feel like that understanding of that? Oh, there's something else here, that's deeper than what was understood.
Well, I think at first I thought, well, this is peculiar. Like, why is it behaving so differently? And then I read some papers by a scientist called Robert Provine, and he was about the only person who'd done any like extensive psychological research into laughter. And I read his papers, and he said, well, laughter actually, we think it's about jokes and humour, but actually it's primarily a social behaviour. And I thought, well, that's wrong, What does he know? Obviously it's about jokes and humour. But then everything that I did with it following that point onwards just confirmed that he was right. And it was, so for me, it was less of a sort of feeling of discovery. And at first it was a feeling of like, well, I thought I knew what this was. Is it not that? And the longer I worked with it, the more I came to see that actually, although we do laugh at things that are funny, laughter is more like this kind of expression of social joy. It's an emotion that lives in interactions with another human. You do laugh when you're on your own, but you are vastly more likely to laugh when you're with other people. And then when you laugh with other people, it's a very truthful sign of how you feel about those other people. If you take recordings of people, just pairs of people laughing, and you play, or having a conversation, and just take out the bits where they're laughing together and play them to total strangers, those strangers can predict with some accuracy how close two friends are just from how they laugh together. So it's really modulated by other people, but it's really, you give away a lot of how you feel about other people when you laugh with them. So there's something really kind of beautiful about that, I think.
I think I totally agree. And I want to get more into that kind of understanding about how the role of laughter plays in like human interactions a little bit later. But you mentioned something too about the human aspect of it too. When did you realize that this neuroscience that you were interested in was actually deeply human, and it was actually more than just kind of the academic pursuit? It was also human understanding.
Well, I think if I go back years and years ago, so I was looking at emotion in the voice, but I haven't started looking at laughter. And this is like the end of the 90s. My father fell very, very ill. Like, he just had these catastrophic health events. Every time you got him out of hospital, something else would go wrong, and he was back in hospital. And we were back for, I think, like the third time with him mortally ill, and he was visibly fading in front of us. The doctors didn't know what to do. And like you are often in hospital, we were all just sitting around going, waiting for someone to do something. And we were all silent. And my father suddenly said, oh, we've laughed a lot, haven't we? And I was like, yeah, we have, Dad, we have. And he actually, it was all right. He had another 14 happy years. So they put him on a drug that was killing him, and they took him off the drug. So he had, another very happy 14 years with us. And not long after he'd actually finally passed away, many years later, and I was getting more involved in thinking about laughter, and I was coming around to this Robert Provine idea about it being this kind of, it's a social behaviour. And I thought, actually, my dad was right. At the time, I just thought, why not? Let's laugh. Now I think, no, he's absolutely right. Because if you can look back at a life full of laughter, it means you've had the chance to share this really beautiful moments of sort of joy with the people you really care about. And what else is there?
Absolutely.
Laughter is this beautiful kind of index about how you really feel about the people that you're with. And if you get to be with the people you really love and you get to laugh with them, what more could you want?
I completely agree. I think I look at my family and like how, because I think that's why I was always interested in this topic, because I grew up in a family where we all have that. There's a big community. There's like ten members of our family, and it's always laughter, it's
Yeah,
always
yeah.
because, this uncle is making fun of this, your child is getting it, he's making fun of it. So it's like in a household here,
Yeah.
it's like everyone is just like, laughter is always something I felt deeply connected to my person, my
Yeah.
being, especially as I've gotten older, and I can see it in my friendship. I can see when I meet
Yeah.
someone, immediately I'm trying to find a way for us to connect on that field too, on that kind of like laughter. And some of my closest friends are the people that can make me laugh.
Yeah.
They just doing nothing at all, just
Yeah.
like how
Yeah.
they are. I just look at them and I just start laughing and
Yeah.
just be like, well, what's funny? And I'm like, I don't know. It's just,
It's because you love your friends.
Yeah.
There's no funny
nothing.
thing.
Yeah,
exactly. It's them.
it's just the connection that you have.
Yeah.
Another thing that was also really that interests me about how you teach this subject, because I've seen you do a couple of really, really good lectures and also a TED talk, which is amazing.
That was good fun. I
It was
enjoyed
really,
that,
really good. You did really, really well, guys. 100% go check it out. But yeah, one thing I found you did really well was that in your teaching about laughter, you also have a humor about with the way that you communicate it. You used recordings of people, different types of laughter. There was one French woman that had a laughter that was completely unbelievable. I did not think that was actually, but it was right, wasn't it?
It is extraordinary laughter. And she says herself in French, Mon Dieu, c'est quoi ça? My God, what is that? Where did that come from? She makes incredible noises.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So the question was, was there a point in time that you thought actually it's good to integrate laughter in how I teach this, or was it just a natural thing that's happened?
It was actually quite deliberate. So the first time I got asked to do a public TEDx talk, it was in 2012, and is when I was kind of getting more into this journey of really connecting with what laughter really means, like this kind of social, joyful, close emotional experience you have with people. And they asked me to do it, and I thought, well, I could do it, or I could do it and make it funny. And if you make it funny, then people they can be laughing as well as thinking about laughter. But also, I must admit, I've been to very serious scientific talks on laughter, and they're very, very boring. Because people are, shut up, no, this is very serious. You've got to let people engage with their bits, and then I think it does, I mean, really the strategy was, you can be learning about it, but also doing it, and maybe that helps you think about it a bit differently. Like, what did I just laugh at then?
Absolutely, and I think it's so interesting too, because like you're teaching about how that happens in human beings, and then you can see the audience kind of like they laugh themselves at the moments, and you could always have a mirror to them and be like, oh look, you're laughing too because you understood this, or because you thought this was surprising or something like that. The other point that I wanted to get into too was I think, like you mentioned before, we always think like laughter is about jokes. And I think that's what the previous study was about. But obviously you found that laughter is more of talking about how it's more of a function rather than jokes. How does that appear in the research and also in what you've learned?
So it's, if you look at people laughing, so you're 30 times more likely to laugh if there's somebody else there than if you're on your own, and you'll laugh more if you know those people, and you'll laugh more if you like those people. So you've got this very sort of social behaviour. It's primed by other people being there, and then it's sort of enhanced by how close you feel to those people. And what that means in practice is most laughter lives in conversations, because that's how humans manage social interactions. We talk to each other, or we have a sign language conversation, but we have some sort of live interaction. And that's where laughter lives. And in those conversations, laughter, I mean, sometimes we are laughing because something's funny. Somebody may have told a joke, then maybe you remember something funny from the television. That definitely happens. But there's also a load of other reasons why we laugh. But sometimes we're laughing just through contagion, because we catch laughter from other people. That's still social. You're much more likely to catch a laugh from someone you know than someone you don't know. So sometimes it's just being transmitted like that. Sometimes you're laughing because of how you feel with those people. Laughter something, it's associated in other animals with play, and we do laugh when we're playing. So when you're being playful, you'll laugh with people. And that sometimes bleeds into humour, I think. But we'll also use laughter communicatively. So we'll use laughter to show that we understand what somebody said, or we recognise what somebody said, or we get the implication of what somebody said. And in fact, Robert Provine found at any one point in time, the person who laughs most in the conversation is frequently the person who's talking. So they're using the laughter to get the people they're talking to show they remember, show they understand, show they agree by joining in with the laughter. So it's a hall of mirrors. We'll also use laughter to kind of try and manage other emotional states. So people will use laughter to try to mask other emotions. So people will use, if they're starting to cry or they're angry or they're really sad, they'll use laughter to kind of cover that up, like a sort of masking behaviour. I was listening to a podcast a while ago, and this woman was telling a very sad story about a dog, and she started crying and she immediately started laughing at herself. And it was it was just covering up the emotion. It was just covering up the actual crying that she was doing. And we will also use laughter to try and deal with stressful situations. And the interesting thing there is that will work if everybody laughs. So if you share laughter, like if you and your friend are talking in a difficult situation, but one of you makes a joke about something and you both start laughing, you will feel better together. If only one person laughs, that actually, if anything, you feel slightly worse. Yeah. So it's a very, very common use of laughter is actually dealing with stress. And the hallmark there is sharing the laughter. In fact, you just keep coming back to this time and again. It's not just that laughter happens in interactions. It's that a lot of the good stuff in laughter is happening when you share the laughter, when you laugh together. There's something special about laughing together.
Okay, let's zoom in on that too, because that's what's fascinates me a lot about it too, because I've recognized that implicitly in my relationships with people, just like, oh, okay, I share more and feel closer to you when we laugh more, or like if we have an issue and we laugh about it, we feel that kind of connection.
Yeah.
So from your research, what age do you think that starts, and how do you think we develop that as we get older?
Well, with the proviso that there's still not enough research into this, it starts really early. So human babies, from not long after they're born, they can cry and they can indicate displeasure with things, or they need things. And of course, arguably, from an evolutionary perspective, they need to be able to do that. Babies use laughter. Like I can still, in my head, imagine my son's pain cry, which fortunately I didn't hear very often, but just this ringing sound. I mean, you just got to sort this out now. You can't let this will not stand. And then and that was different from his tired cry, and it was different from his hungry cry, and that's a very, very common, but so there's a communicative aspect to crying from the outset. And then at around 3 months old, babies start laughing. And the interesting thing there is they don't show any contagious laughter. They don't laugh when a parent laughs, but they'll laugh at things the parent does. And there's something very truthful about babies' laughter, because they don't laugh because they like you or they're trying to make you feel better about something. They laugh because that's brilliant. What you just did with that piece of paper, or what you just did with that peekaboo game, that's just brilliant, And so that arguably is, tickling will also work. It's all social. These are all things you have to do with somebody else there. The babies don't start laughing on their own, and in fact, babies that are deaf and blind, so they've never heard or seen anybody else laughing, they will still, if a parent tickles them, they will laugh. So it's a sort of prepotent thing that can appear, but it's communicative and it's bonding right from the outset. So it seems to be important for kind of making, kind of the baby laughs. The parent is trying to make the baby laugh because that's nice. And then the parent laughs when the baby laughs. And basically that's us starting to teach the babies to laugh together, so that contagious behaviour. There's other contagious things like yawning and coughing, but and they're all learned. Laughter has this it's appearing very early, and it has this kind of playful bonding role, and everything's kind of built on that. So if you look at, again, so we don't know enough about it, but by the time babies are kind of going into toddlers, so they're getting around 1, they don't have much language, but they're certainly not saying very much, but they understand a lot of what's said. You find that, these big babies, young toddlers, they will use a parent's laughter to work out if a situation is dangerous or not. So if you put them in a situation where an experimenter is doing something funny, some peculiar behaviour is going on, and if the baby will sort of clock the peculiar behaviour, and then if the mum is laughing, they'll be like, oh, this is funny. And if the mum's not laughing, they're like, oh, I'm not so certain about this. And not long after that, they will do things to intentionally make their parents laugh. So long before we've got good use of spoken language, babies are using laughter in a pretty sophisticated way to sort of scaffold, like frame interactions. What does this situation mean? How can I make you laugh? That's pretty complex. And there must be more to do. Clearly a lot more to this, but I've been trying for years to get some funding to actually look at this. But that developmental trajectory is obviously just gets more and more complex, because like at some age, children start to learn to laugh in a way that's not just like a very truthful baby laughter, like that's killing me, you know, starting to laugh in a more kind of intentional way, which a lot of laughter is. That conversational laughter is mostly people, you know, at some level intentionally using the laughter to kind of help the interaction. It doesn't mean to say I now decide to laugh, but you're kind of, you know, when you laugh to show agreement with something, that's not you helpless with laughter on the floor. There's an intentional element to that. And again, this is the plural of anecdote is not data, but I used to take my son to when he was younger, there's a fantastic thing called Comedy Club for Kids, where they run a proper comedy show for children, proper comedians, and it's all clean. And I started taking him when he was like 4. And the first time I took him, I noticed he was laughing really strangely. And what he was doing was he was watching me. And he was laughing when I laughed at a joke and then going, ha, 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 I too understand why that is funny. And then when he's about 7, I remember taking him and he was just watching the comedian go, oh, it's funny because it's true. And he doesn't need any of that kind of social thing now. And that will have tracked him having a better understanding of using laughter in this more kind of complex way. But you also have to learn about the difference between people sharing laughter with you and laughing at you. That's that, you know. Again, my son went through a stage where, well, everyone will have done, when we were at some party and there were boys laughing at him he went to a different school from him and he didn't know them. And they were laughing at him because he was, oh, look how he does this. He's a stranger. And he was laughing along because he thought they were laughing with him. We had to leave the party. I thought my partner was going to hit somebody. It was very stressful. And then within 4 months, he completely flipped. And we were watching he got really into The Simpsons. And do you remember the start of The Simpsons movie? There's a whole bit where Bart does his roller skate, his skateboard thing, but he's completely in the nude. And it's very funny. And we were watching it laughing, and my son was furious and saying, stop laughing at Bart, stop it. I mean, no, we're not laughing at him. It's just something, so he'd gone completely the other way. Now I know you can be laughed at, and I'm looking for it everywhere. And you have to learn that. And then you start learning, okay, so that, you know, and as far as I can see, throughout your entire early adult life, this is something you're still learning about. I mean, again, adolescence, when your social world is now no longer you and your family, it's you and your friends. And that's where your laughter goes, and where the things that you laugh at together start. You know, my son now is a teenager, like, oh, Mum, you don't understand, you know, this. And it's true, it's because it's not for me, it's for teens, you know, it's for his group. He's showing his social allegiances by how he laughs and who he's laughing with. So, you know, we're all on that sort of journey. But it also, then it stays pretty complex, I think. So by the time you're an adult, it's a very nuanced behaviour, laughter. It's a very complex social behaviour.
I think that's the perfect way to describe it. It's like, because you are right, like when we start as children, it's a very simple kind of reaction to what we see and like how we communicate with our caregivers, right?
True joy.
True, like just like from an internal. But then as you get older, know that there's complexity with it. Yeah. You see how other people can use it against you. Yeah. You see how other people can like bring it out of you through actions. And comedians are like the best example of that. Yeah. How they would like kind of like work a whole joke to just elicit that laughter from you. Yeah, I think one thing I've always been fascinated about too is how we use laughter to kind of navigate those social bonds. You mentioned your son when he's first of interacting with people. Understanding laughter is a very important part to like making friends and understanding. So talk to me a little bit more about that. What role does that play in there?
It's very important for making and maintaining social bonds, and those might be social bonds that are very transient. I remember getting on a train, and when you're on a train, you get a double seat to yourself, and you're like, yes, results. And there was a woman across from me, and she got 4 seats all to herself, and then just before the train lit off, these 2 men got on, and they both had like cups of coffee, and they sat opposite her. And she said, was, I'm going to have to move. I can't deal with the smell of coffee. But what she did was she said it by really loads of laughter, and they laughed. And what was just, actually, look, I want to move because you smell. That's basically what she's saying. But it was all managed really skillfully because she laughed, they laughed, everybody understood, we're all fine. And I kind of said that they're never going to be your friends together in the future, presumably. But the laughter was, and negotiating with the laughter on the part of everybody concerned in that was what made it not just, oh I'm going away. And that's really transient, but it's all the way through to, like you're seeing an old friend. you're almost laughing just thinking about the chance to get to laugh with them, and it's that's the maintaining of the social bonds. And then there's space in the middle when you meet new people and you find that you are laughing together, you feel closer to them. Maybe that's a new friendship on the way. So it's a sort of it's a sign of how you feel, and it's also seems to be like the mechanism for enhancing those bonds. So when you see an old friend or you're making a new friend, laughing together is making you feel closer. And it's also making you feel better together. Literally, your mood will be improving together. So you're both in the moment feeling the benefit of that interaction, and you're also strengthening the social bonds you have. And we know that social bonds are almost the most important aspect of your life. The size and the strength of your social network predicts your physical health, your mental health, and even how long you'll live. So, and that's because those are the people you talk to, and those are the people you laugh with.
I think I also want to take a little step back and explain, because I know that I think one of your lectures you talked about what happens to us when we laugh. What happens to our rib cages and stuff like that, and how that kind of affects the voices. And so speak a little bit more about that too, about what's happening to our body and what the sounds are coming from.
So laughter's been described as more like a different way of breathing than it is a different way of speaking. So when you're, we're breathing all the time. So we use our rib cage and the muscles between our ribs. We contract those muscles that pulls the rib cage out and up, and that pulls air into your lungs, and then just relax them back down. So you've got that going on all the time. You're doing that, don't stop. When we start talking, we use those same muscles very differently. We take a breath in, and then we very finely control the flow of air out. We don't just have this elastic recoil pushing the air out, and that's actually enabling us to make a sound out of our voice box. So if you're singing or you're speaking or you're beatboxing, all the things humans can do with their voices are dependent on that. And if I keep talking without taking another breath, you can hear it having to work really, really hard. And if you laugh, what you get is, instead of that kind of smooth, continuous in-out of what's called metabolic breathing to stay alive, or that very fine control for breathing for speech and song, what you have is single, large squeezing of the whole rib cage, those intercostal muscles also pushing air out at once. Ha, 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 ha. Each one of those contractions is just pushing air out of you. And that's giving you a very basic sound. There's nothing complex happening up here at all. It doesn't look at all like speech. But it's also giving you a sound that's it's relatively easy to make, which is probably why babies can do it. In fact, crying and laughing are quite similar in this respect. They're quite similar in terms of how they come out of you. And there's something we don't really understand, but in terms of how your brain is able to have control over your motor system, if there's a competition between breathing and talking or singing and laughing, the laughter will win. If you've had that experience and you're laughing and you really should not have been laughing and you're desperately trying not to, and these noises keep coming out of you.
Something that you
can't talk through it. Exactly. And that's, there's a sort of amazing examples, but there's some sort of almost like privileged access that laughter has to the motor system, because lots of things can't do that. Crying can do it. Laughter can do it.
I think that's so true. I think, you mentioned that example when I have so many memories where I'll be talking to a friend, I'll be trying to explain the joke, but because I'm trying to explain the joke, I'm thinking about the joke and I can't get it out because I'm dying of laughter, and he's standing there like, go on, let me know. I need to know. And I think that makes it even more funny. And it's exactly. I think that's the role that the laughter has. And I think that's why it's so fascinating to study, because you can really pick it apart from so many different angles, even though it's just such a thing that you just feel like you just naturally do.
So for me, it started out as let's look at an emotional expression, and now it's taking me through into how we regulate emotion, the nature of friendship, how we make and maintain social bonds, why it feels good to laugh. All these different things are kind of just laughter takes you off in these different directions all the time.
Okay, so on that kind of topic, I've always wondered what happens if you don't understand laughter from an early age. How does that role, what role does that play in your social kind of interactions, and how does that affect you later on?
We're still looking at this, but there clearly are big developmental implications of how you've learned to laugh. I've described there is that sort of long period if you're learning how to use this thing. So we found that teenage boys who are at risk of psychopathy, so that means they have have conduct disorders, so they're badly behaved, but they also score highly on tests of what are called callous and unemotional traits. And what that means is they behave badly and they don't care if they hurt somebody. That's what's so conduct disorder, that doesn't put you at risk of psychopathy. Lots of people have a conduct disorder. But if you have a conduct disorder, so you behave badly and you don't care if you hurt people, that's when it looks more dangerous. That's when you've got that. And it doesn't mean to say those boys will all become psychopaths, but they're at risk. They've got the right psychological profile. And we scanned them compared to a group of normally developing teenage boys. And we had them listening to laughter. And what we found was in the brain of the teenage boys, as you see in adults, when people hear laughter, you can actually see the brain primed to join in. And that's almost certainly the brain system that's underlying that contagiousness of laughter. So that's sort of, it's very hard not to laugh. If you're around a friend and that friend laughs, you find it very hard not to join in with them. So you're seeing that kind of priming response, and that priming response was significantly reduced in the teenage boys at risk of psychopathy. And if you give them laughter and ask them to rate how much does this make you want to join in, they rate it less. Now, what we can't tell from this is correlation or causation, because you don't know if correlation doesn't prove causation. I mean, so they have this reduced brain response and they have this reduced sort of behavioural response to laughter. We don't know if the experiences they've had, because they have this psychological profile, mean they haven't had the opportunities to learn to laugh. Maybe their family they grew up in, just people were not laughing around them. Or if their psychological profile meant they couldn't. We can't, which way around, what's caused what here, we can't tell. But what we can say is, if you don't laugh when other people laugh, you are missing out on a really huge way that humans make and maintain social bonds. And it's presumably much easier for you to feel quite separate to other people and much more able to treat them in a functional way, which is, again, another hallmark of psychopathy. So that would be one possibility. And just in general, really, we've created a psychological test for sort of picking up on people's experiences of laughter. And we find quite big differences. So people vary a lot in how much they think they laugh. People vary in how much they like laughter. They vary in how much they understand other people's use of laughter. They vary in how much they understand their own use of laughter. And that variation must come from somewhere. So again, something that we're really keen to do is actually to take that back and look at this developmental trajectory and see if we can, what is actually underlying this. Is it, if you grow up in a house without a lot of laughter, does that just mean that you are an adult who laughs less, or what other, or does it have no impact on you? Does it, is it coming via a totally different route?
Yeah, I think you mentioned something that's so fascinating. I think the relationship, or laughter's relationship to personality or emotion, they're based on whether it's nature or nurture, and growing up in that's so interesting. I think that tells a lot about people. And I think when you meet someone, it also kind of gives you some perspective. If they're not laughing a lot, maybe it's not you, maybe it's something growing up. Exactly, and it's their family which really values laughter at all. So or they don't even understand how laughter is used in a social situation or something like that.
Exactly, and it's just they've maybe never learned to use laughter to deal with, say, social awkwardness or a stressful situation, because it's learned behaviour. And they developed other strategies.
Speaking on that, I want to now zoom out a bit to kind of look at the evolutionary kind of perspective. So one question I always had, might be a funny question, but what do you think cavemen were laughing about?
I think they would have been laughing at I should rephrase this. As far as we can see, so assuming that cavemen are modern humans, and as far as we can see, there hasn't been any big evolutionary change in the brains of modern humans. So when humans appear on Earth, their world they're living in is different, but they're not fundamentally different humans from us. They eat different food, and there's other, but there's all environmental stuff. Their building blocks of their bodies and their brains are the same. And it is really interesting that although you can find analogues of humour in other... Sorry, scrub that, you can't. You can find analogues of laughter in other animals, including our closest ape relatives, and presumably also early humans. Modern humans were showing that as well. You only find humour in humans. So I think what we can probably say is that they were probably laughing at everything we laugh at. They were laughing with friends. They were laughing together. They were maybe laughing when things were stressful. But what's different between us and all the other animals is they will have been laughing at stuff that was funny. And we know this because although there's no fossil record of laughter, what you can find in the archaeological record is examples of jokes as early as you can find humans making marks on the world, writing things down. You find them writing down jokes. There's a ancient Mesopotamian clay tablet so someone thought this joke was so good, they kind of stamped it into this clay tablet, and we know it's a joke. I'm not saying the Mesopotamians were cavemen, but we're limited by when writing started. And the joke goes, a dog walks into a tavern, says, "I can't see anything, I'll open this one." That you can see a joke there, can't you? See, like a man walks into a pub, exactly. Three men walk into a bar. It's absolutely got that shape. It's not funny to us because all the cultural stuff is so different between Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, and now. Is the dog? Is that really a dog, or is it like a word to describe maybe a sort of bit more low life human? Is the tavern really a tavern, or does it also mean a brothel? There's some other kind of implication. Does he talk about that? I can't see anything. I'll open this one. Does he mean a door? Does he mean his eyes? What there's a lot. If I had a time machine, that's when I'd want to go back to find out why was this funny. And the Romans had a whole book called The Laughter Lover, which again, I mean, some of you can see the shape of jokes. They are very rarely funny, and they lean very heavily on crucifixion to a degree that is disturbing to us. But that's, and you get it in graffiti. It's there. As soon as humans are making a mark on the world, and so there's something very human about humour. So whatever is making the cavemen laugh probably will have been not that different. It'd be all the kind of social stuff that we laugh at and the humorous stuff that we laugh at, but probably the humorous stuff that they laughed at might be a bit harder for us to follow.
Yeah, I understand also, yeah.
Possibly where you've done any commonality. So the main thing that we've learned from the psychology of humour over time and over place, there's no one thing that everybody always finds funny. But the most general things that are funny tend to be stuff where you don't need words to understand them. So that's slapstick humour, or jokes about taboo things like, toilet humour or sexual humour. So it's almost, if you want to take it back to something that, if for humour, there probably would have been that if there was something that was recognisable to us, it would be along those lines.
That's so fascinating. Because you think about just like how we spoke about before about how a lot of like laughter is like a social interaction, and if how their society was built, and if they hadn't, or maybe they had developed that kind of like societal understanding that we have, where they had laughed differently, or maybe it would have been kind of like an internal process where kind of like just like how babies have, like it could kind of very early caveman would have been something that would just come out of them. They see something and that's funny, and then once they build a society later on, they start finding actually like, oh, actually this is funny. And like the dog walks into, I mean, that's where that comes from, and that's like a fascinating thing. Like if you don't understand the culture, you find it difficult to understand.
No, we need the cultural stuff so much, and you even find. I mean, now if you look around the world, somebody actually did studies to prove this. Well done, scientists. They took jokes written in French by French people and translated them into English and presented them to people in Australia, and then they got Australian jokes in English and translated them into French, and lo and behold, the jokes don't translate because the more barriers there are to you understanding a joke, the less likely it is that you'll find it funny. And the barriers can be linguistic, or they can be cultural, or they can be personal. Even for a slapstick joke, like there's trying to think, imagine if you walking down the street and you slipped on a banana skin and you broke your leg, you probably wouldn't find that very funny, because actually people can get really hurt that way, It's and so there'll always be someone going, that's not funny, my uncle died that way, and that's so there'll always be that personal reason why no, that's not for me. So you never find one thing that's absolutely guaranteed to make everybody laugh, but you see trends.
Yeah. I think I remember you talking about I think it was a culture that was like an uncontacted tribe, or maybe a very old tribe that had a lot of tradition, and they kind of used humor different, like the way they would act.
Yeah,
would show humor. Would you like to speak a little bit about that?
I mean, there are phenomenal differences around the world in this, but there's a guy it's called Matthew Gervais, and he's a sort of anthropologist, ethnologist, and who's studied humour. And he was working, I think it was an island in the Philippines, where there's a culture of that there are days which are funny days.
Wow.
And on those days, you're allowed to make jokes. And the jokes are pretty strictly defined in terms of who can make them towards who and in what way. And the jokes don't necessarily look like jokes to us. There's one where somebody threw a puppy at a pig. No. I know, it was just quite upsetting. But it was a sort of, that was, but it was kind of, the right person was doing it in the right context. And you were allowed to do it because today's a day when we do these things. So you find all human cultures share laughter and they'll all have humour, but there will be very strong cultural rules about exactly where and when it's polite or impolite to laugh and exactly how. So it's not unusual in the Far East to use laughter to mark very bad news, receiving extremely bad news, in a way that kind of has its roots in something similar to us using laughter in a stressful situation, but we wouldn't respond to bad news with laughter, and it can be a bit jolting to us if it happens. It's got the same roots. And you get the same with humour. So all you can say is there definitely will be humour. It's just that it will be different. We did a programme for Horizon a few years ago, and they did. I see if I can find you the clips on YouTube, but they did lots of interviews with people around the world about what makes you laugh, and there were these women. I can't remember which country they came from in Africa, but it was all the jokes were about guinea fowl. She's got a guinea fowl in her handbag. And they're like, oh no, just guinea fowl are very funny. And they made the guinea fowl funny. I believe them by the end of it. So, we don't make jokes about guinea fowl here because we're just not very familiar with guinea fowl, or the cultural meaning of guinea fowl, or what it might mean to have a guinea fowl in your handbag, So it's sort of beautiful for that. It's kind of reflecting something we've all got in common, and then the total flowering and beauty of human diversity of experience that then builds on that.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I think one other question I had also was the relationship between language and laughter. Like, which do you think came first? Do you think we started laughing and then we built the language from there, or do you think laughter have to come from language?
I think laughter comes first because it's evolutionarily older than us. We're not the only animals that laugh. And in fact, if you look at other apes, obviously we're apes, laughter is pretty similar. Our laughter is louder. And ape laughter is quite gentle, but it's kind of... It sounds like laughter, and they do it when they're playing, and they do it when they're tickling infants, when the young infant's being tickled. And in fact, chimpanzees laugh differently if they are being tickled than if they're trying to make play last longer, which is that's quite a complex use. And people have argued that, in fact, actually, it's probably something you find across mammals. The only reason is we haven't described it before is that people haven't been looking for it. A guy called Greg Bryant has been looking for it. It makes a good argument for this. So from that perspective, laughter was something that we as apes already have. And then, so we're another laughing ape. We're also, and then there's some qualitative difference about modern humans that mean things like understanding intentions and being able to use spoken language comes in a way that's just don't see it in other mammals. Certainly you don't see it in other primates. And that gives us, the ability to deal with spoken language and later down the line written language. But it's interesting that even when we can express at some level everything in the words we want to say, when you're talking to somebody, we drop into this sort of ancient mammal behaviour to do a lot of the emotional lifting of a conversation, to show you're regretful of something, or you're happy about something, or you remember something that so you're doing a lot of the kind of emotional work with the laughter and interleaving it with human speech, which is kind of unparalleled in nature for its complexity and the sort of, both in terms of the sounds we make and the linguistic systems we're reflecting with it. Then this very, at some level, very basic but very complex, ancient emotional expression that we are just peppering our speech with. People laugh all the time, and for very complex reasons, and that we just integrate it into our understanding of the interaction. So there's something really glorious about that, I think.
I completely agree. I think it's almost primal, right? It's like that kind of like that connection to something that was way before even all this language started to appear, and now this social connection is like, oh, cool, how we used to connect as primates still kind of stays with us. So we've just kind of dressed it up in language. And linguistic kind of like whatever. I think one thing I've always been fascinated by was the like you mentioned animals, and I want to really get into that just to show the difference between how animals use laughter and how we use laughter. The question I had was, do you think animals use laughter to bond? And like, if not, why did they laugh? And a little bit
No,
about
I
that.
think it is for bonding. You see something very similar between humans and other animals in that when laughter's first seen, it's seen in infancy, in interactions with a parent, and in fact, it's tickling is a really key across mammals. So that's when you first see laughter for baby chimpanzees and gorillas, but it's also for baby rats. That's when laughter first emerges. And the interesting thing about humans is tickling. The right person tickles a human baby, they'll laugh. But in fact, non-physical things will make a human baby laugh as well. So peekaboo stuff. You don't need it's like laughter can jump the gap between us. We don't need that physical contact. But then back to the animals. So it's this socially bonding to joyful behaviour from the outset. But then it becomes really closely associated with play. And play is a really important behaviour for mammals. All mammals play when they're juveniles. Some of them, like humans and dogs and otters, play their whole lives. And play is important because you're part of how we train up our big mammal brains. We also learn about our social world, and it varies from animal to animal. So a baby kitten plays differently from a baby horse. And you need to show that your intentions are playful because otherwise they could be misinterpreted as, say, aggressive. So animals tend to show that they're being playful with what's called play face, kind of loose open, happy mouth, like that. And something you see it quite a lot with like goats and horses and things. It's what's called Freudensprung. Even rats do it. They kind of jump with joy. So you get this physical jumping up and down, open mouth. And when there's a noise associated with that, it's laughter. So it's social bonding. It's showing these kinds of playful behavioural intentions. And in fact, Panksepp, who did a lot of work with the rats, he argued that it's acting like a kind of an invitation to play. Come on, let's do this fun behaviour. And studies from America have shown that if rats are devocalised, so they can't make any sounds, they will still play with other rats because they're very social animals, and that's one of the things they do when they're with other rats, that they know that play behaviours will happen. They can't make the sounds that indicate they're being playful, and they're more likely to get bitten during play because they can't show, just like play getting out of hand for humans, it can get out of hand for rats, and it's more unlikely to get out of hand if you can't make the sounds that indicate you're being playful. So that's pretty complex in rats. We know that in rats, the more you tickle a baby the more you tickle a baby rat, the more that rat will laugh when it's tickled as an adult. So you can develop and enhance and encourage the laughter, just like you were talking about with humans. That's definitely true in rats. You can do experiments with rats you can't do with humans. So it's pretty complex in rats. Think about what that means for us. I think is quite dizzying.
That's amazing. That's fascinating. I think also another point also about the complexity. I know you've talked about Coco the gorilla.
Yeah.
So talk to me about Coco the gorilla and how what role does laughter play in her experiment?
Well, she there's a really beautiful clip, and it's on YouTube, when she's introduced to the late comedian Robin Williams, and she signs because she could use American Sign Language. There's debate about how much language she could actually use, but she certainly, when she meets him, she signs tickle, and she's really like serious about it, like tickle me. You said you would, and it's hard to tickle a gorilla. So at first he's struggling to do it, and then when he manages to get her laughing, she just looks so human. She's doing, her face is creasing up, her mouth's open like this, and she's batting him away and sort of protecting herself. It looks so recognisable. Now, you can't hear her laughing very loudly because, as they say, laughter in other apes, it's a gentle sound, whereas we laugh really loud. We want to be heard by other humans. But there's something really beautiful about that. There's also, I'll see if I can find it for you, but there's a clip on the BBC website, a zookeeper from some zoo in the southeast of England, and he's working with a female gorilla, and he can tickle her and make her laugh, and she'll let him do that. And it's actually desperately moving because they clearly have really quite a strong emotional bond, and you see it in the closeness. She lets him do this behaviour and they both enjoy it. There's something really lovely about it.
That's amazing. That's beautiful, because I think that's so true, right? I think there's a connection that, the fact that you mentioned that laughter is cross species, doesn't only apply to human beings. It shows that that's something that connects us. That's something that's core, that can be before human beings, and it makes it kind of like gives you that kind of like I guess that humility almost. To understand that this is something that's bigger.
It's bigger. It's bigger and older than us.
Yeah, bigger.
It's like this. Just track it, or probably right the way back to the first mammal.
Yeah. A question I have too: what in human beings? Why do you think it's kind of stayed so long? What do you think is the evolutionary function of laughter for human beings?
I think it's extremely useful. So it's helping us with making and maintaining social bonds right from the start of life, and that's incredibly important. Like I say, your social network, the social bonds you have with other people, unbelievably important to you. And it helps you manage emotional states. So the way people will, when they're with friends or their partners, use laughter together to feel better in difficult situations, that's very effective. You're both, by the end of it, feeling better together and also more bonded. And couples who can do that, certainly the data from married couples shows people who laugh together in stressful situations not only feel less stressed, but stay together for longer. So it's helping your relationship. It's also a really useful, nuanced way of communicating with somebody else. So, being able to laugh to show that you recognise an illusion or you understand, he do be like that, That's really useful. It's useful for sort of managing interactions and making them go more smoothly, even if you're doing so in quite a deliberate way. Robin Dunbar at Oxford has found that if you can get people laughing in the lab, they will tell you more intimate things about themselves because you're sort of reverse engineering that intimacy sense. And actually that, that could be very useful. So there's a study showing that if you look at parts of the world with higher levels of historic migration, so somewhere like Western Europe, you find that laughter and smiling in public interactions, they're both more common and they're less ambiguous in how they're shown. And the argument goes that if you're in a part of the world where you can't assume that you share a language with everybody you meet, then a positive social emotional expression like laughter and smiling become more important because you can use them to manage interactions in a smooth way without having to, such that you can get past the fact that you might not each actually understand everything what the other's saying. And that, whereas somewhere like China, with much lower levels of historic migration, public smiling and laughing is less common and is less. And my PhD student, who was Chinese, said this study is rubbish because people in China laugh a lot. And of course, it's not saying they don't; it's saying in public. This is, in private situations, absolutely certain they laugh a great deal. I know this. They then replicated that in North America, different states in the USA. States with higher levels of historic migration, you get more laughter, you get more smiling in public. So that's going to show how extremely useful laughter is if you're in situations where you have to be having interactions with people that might have very different languages and backgrounds to you, because you can use it to make things just go more smoothly, even if, I've said you might never see those people again. So it's got tremendous utility, both for like the very closest relationships you have with people and some of the most transient possible ones. It's equally useful for both, I'd argue.
That's so true. And I think I feel that a lot. I think I see that in real life too. I think I want to focus now on the kind of the human condition and like how the role of laughter plays in that human condition. I know we talked a lot about the neuroscience and also like the evolutionary traits from the beginning, from your research too. But I want to now kind of give some observations about how laughter and the role it has in emotion specifically. So, do you think, first, let's start, I think I want to start here about kind of like looking at the statement. Do you think that laughter is undervalued, especially in the role of science and especially in the role of how we use it to communicate? We understand it in science or in politics or even in like having difficult conversations. Different society doesn't look at laughter as seriously, ironically.
We take it absolutely for granted. We think it's a very kind of a sort of uncivilized behaviour, if anything. So you see that in the science. It doesn't feel like a sensible, proper, serious business for a scientist. I have colleagues who think I'm an idiot for studying it. It's like saying I study tinsel or fairy lights or something. So that feels trivial. And in fact, it's interesting, if you go back to the first sort of person to study emotion in this way of thinking about it in a sort of scientific way was actually Charles Darwin. And it's really interesting if you go back to his book on the expression of emotions in man and other animals, because he talked a lot about laughter. He thought it really mattered. He thought it was an expression of joy, and he valued it a great deal. And then in the sort of development of experimental psychology and neuroscience over the next 150 years, we picked up a lot of what he talked about with emotion and the fact that it can be found in other animals, but it was all for stuff like fear and anger and disgust and sadness. We just ignored what he said about laughter. And it doesn't feel serious. It doesn't feel like it could help you understand sort of clinical conditions. And actually, I think it also reflects, in the West, a great undervaluing of laughter in general. So you see this, people always think that stand-up comedians are just riffing. They are never just riffing. Why would they do that? They have worked out that routine over years and months, and they've absolutely honed it to get the best laugh. It is perfectly put together. Exactly, exactly. And there is no way they are just going to I'll just riff this one. It's never just pull it out of my hat. It's just somehow easier to imagine that it's easy for them than that they've really worked hard at doing this, because that's serious work. And you see it in the Oscars. I think the last time somebody for a funny film got anywhere near the Oscars was the film. Someone was nominated for Best Supporting Actress in the film Bridesmaids. That was 2011. Because it's really hard to make a funny film. That was a very funny film. And it's very hard to be a comic actor or actress. But we sort of imagine something that's easy. It doesn't count. It doesn't count. So and that is quite a big bias in certainly the culture in Western Europe. So if you go back to the kind of medieval period in Western Europe, there was quite a serious argument that Christ had never laughed. With a view, well, would he have ever laughed? And the view that he wouldn't have done, because that is a sort of foolish, trivial, childlike behaviour, whereas, a civilised, thoughtful, serious person would not be laughing.
Wow. That's such an interesting way of looking at like the emotion of laughter.
Yeah.
That it kind of, you ascribe it to something that is just kind of silly, and I think it's, as we've learned today, is something way more deeper, way more
much more
kind of enriching of human beings rather than taking away.
Yes.
It's funny people look at it like that. What I think another question I think on the back of that too, I want to look at kind of the, if someone is going through a lot of like emotional, like, like difficulties, and I know there's I think a lot of my generation, we feel like a lot of things are going on in the world. And I think I try to push the kind of like the behavior of like having laughter, understanding that some things are serious, but some things you can just laugh at, because if you don't laugh at it, it will become too serious and too heavy burdened. So talk to us a little bit more about the role of laughter in healing and like getting people through things.
It's, I think, being able to be in a place where you're comfortable to laugh is really important, because that means we don't laugh randomly with just anybody in just any place. So feeling safe enough and with the right people to be able to laugh, those are that just for your well-being, that's really important, full stop, just to sort of, laugh with the people you love, like I was saying about my dad. But there's something very powerful about being able to laugh at something. And I think that's another reason why we fear it a bit as a culture, because actually there's a sort of wildness to laughter, something a bit uncontrolled. People are laughing at something, anything might happen here. They might not be taking any of it seriously, So being able to laugh at a thing can give you power over it. There's an interesting literature on high stress professions and how they use humour, because what you find running through all of them, and that might be the fire service or the police or nursing or medicine, you get very, very dark humour. And that's almost certainly working in three ways at the same time. So first of all, you're laughing together, so you're bonding together, and these are jobs where you have to work in a team, so you've got to have close links with the people you work with. They are dark because the humorous topics are often dark because they are keeping out people who are not part of that group. You want them to be shocked. I know it's not very nice, but there are a lot of those police WhatsApp groups where the police have been sharing the most appalling material. I guarantee you in the moment they were trying to make people laugh. It's not right, but that's what was happening. And the third thing, so they're all interlinked, the third thing is it's giving you a chance to laugh at a thing that's difficult, that is stressful. And you get power over that and sort of maybe more control over it by being able to laugh at it. You're taking away some of its power to hurt you. And that's an extreme example of a high-stress profession. But I think that's true for everyone to some degree. I mean, there's always going to be things that, okay, it's too soon. I don't want to laugh at this. But there's other things that my father did pass away. My parents lived in France, and we went to the funeral, and this never once occurred to me that, because people drive quite crazily compared to the British, certainly down in the south of France where my parents lived. And the man driving the hearse just set off really fast, and he was doing like these crazy overtakes. So like, even in that, really, it was a terribly sad day, but also like he would have found that genuinely funny.
Yeah,
it was, and it's something it's a reason to laugh together. So it's so there's definitely there's some truth to that. And I think I noticed that the NHS has started, certainly in London, they started part of that kind of social prescribing. They started prescribing doing stand-up comedy classes for people with depression. And I think that's really interesting, because I think that's giving people opportunity to get some power over the stuff that might be hard in their lives, but also to immediately link it to laughter, because there'll be an audience for you.
I completely agree. And I think I've seen the role of that. You mentioned that example. I've seen the role of how laughter plays into my family. Whenever we do have a loss in the family, there is a kind of there is obviously a mourning, and I think that straight away there's a kind of understanding that the person, this is this is how they would have wanted the kind of the situation to be. They wouldn't have wanted also to keep being, kind of somber. They would have tried to lift our spirits.
Exactly.
Especially from the older generation looking at the younger, it's like, oh no, come on, keep the smile on your face, keep laughing, keep that spirit, because don't lose that. And I think that even implicitly, even in that, it's so fascinating to see the role of laughter. We've talked about how it can be used to bond and, how people connect, but also in that, when another end too, when it becomes really difficult, it can also help people lift people back up too. So I think
definitely
fascinating.
Definitely.
That's really, on that point too, what do you think from your research, laughter has taught you about vulnerability and connection? And how people, maybe you mentioned, the kind of a lab experiment, people will be to open up more because of it. What else has it taught you?
I think often when we're talking about laughter, you're talking about connection, you're talking about love. And there's something, so say you don't laugh with just anybody, you don't laugh just anywhere, you laugh with the right people in the right places. And actually, it's made me value that a great deal more. It's obvious when you think about it, but you're of course you laugh more when you're with your family. Of course you laugh more when you love with the people you love. But actually, it's not obvious. It's not at all. And also often we can think, well, an evening spent just giggling, that doesn't feel like it's very serious. But that's actually probably one of the more important points in your day, because you're not only feeling better together, but you're increasing your bonds. And when we went into the first lockdown, my son was 13, and it was really scary. And you couldn't get food, and you couldn't buy toilet paper, and everything was, it's just, he was very anxious. And I think everyone was anxious. And at the end of the first day, I said, okay, right, all putting away our computers, no more homeschooling, no more work. 5:30, we're going to sit down together and we're going to watch something on television that's funny. And it was absolutely just deliberate, so we'd have a reason to laugh together, because the days didn't contain much of that. And we just started doing that every single day, and we got through all of Brooklyn Nine-Nine twice, and so many things. But in fact, it's like nearly 5.5 years later, and we still do that. If we're all at home in the evening, the first thing we do is we sit down and watch something funny, just so it's now become a family tradition. But it also means that we're having a chance to sit down and laugh together. What else has been going on that day doesn't matter. And that's really, I wouldn't have taken laughter as seriously as that before I started working on it. I would have taken it for granted, which is what we all do.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's so important, that understanding. I think that's what I led through my research for this too, but also just, something I've learned from my life. I think in lieu of that too, I think there's so many barriers to laughter. I think we spoke about, some of them are emotional, some of them are social, some of them are just personal. How do you think we can, work to, overcome these barriers to laughter? You can help us in our lives.
Let yourself enjoy it. I think let yourself listen to your laughter. Who do you want to see? Who would make you laugh? Try and spend time with those people, because it's like the laughter is very truthful. We attribute the laughter to people. We'll say, so and so is hilarious. He makes me laugh so hard. What you mean is, I absolutely love so and so, and I show that when I'm around him, because I laugh a lot. And so we attribute it to them, but actually it's our own feeling we're describing. And that really matters, So listen to it, take it seriously, make time for it. You know, there's lots of points in your day when you've got to be very serious and grown up and you can't do this at all. But make sure there's time in the day where you do get to have a bit of that.
I think that actually, before we move on to the club, this has been an amazing conversation. I've got one more question, but I just remembered a question I forgot to ask during what we were talking about before. We were talking about, like, I know you mentioned about forced laughter,
Yeah.
and like just like uncontrollable laughter. And I always found those two very, very hilarious too, because it's like human beings are such a fascinating concept where it's like we can understand something's not funny, but we give it a little haha. And it's like, you know, and sometimes that would make us laugh.
Yeah.
you
Yes.
know?
Yeah.
So talk to me about that. What's the relationship between forced laughter and like why do we do it? What's the role of that in social?
I prefer to think of it as like a sort of intentional communicative laughter, because what I mean is it's not actually helpless, spontaneous laughter. If you think about when you were last time you were laughing and you could not stop laughing, that's when the laughter sort of feels like you just cannot stop producing this behaviour. You're just going to have to ride this out. And then a lot of the conversational laughter that's happening when people are, you know, hanging out, most of it isn't helpless in that it starts and stops quite quickly. It doesn't mean to say it's bad. It's not kind of, you know, or ha, ha, ha. It's often warmly meant and sort of sincerely being offered, but it's at some level under the sort of brain control that the speech is, i.e. it's intentional behaviour rather than something completely unintentional that you can't stop doing. So, and I think that's something my son was learning to do that, and I was noticing it in the comedy club. You know, so it's not that it's forced. It's more it's communicative. So it doesn't feel like you're deliberately trying to produce it, but you are at some level in the same way that you're coming up with the words you want to say. You know, your brain is kind of sort of responding to and part of that is laughter.
Yeah, it becomes almost like a punctuation or like
exactly
the language that we use. Yeah,
and you see that because when people are having a conversation, they laugh together at the ends of sentences. Even if they're having a sign language conversation where they could, in theory, laugh all the way through, they don't. It's like we laugh at these, we sort of punctuate at the end of an idea and on to the next thing.
That's fascinating. Okay, final question. If someone took one thing from your work into their everyday life, what would you hope it to be? I think the work spans so many different fields, or like so many different understanding about human emotions and the human condition in general. But if someone wants to take one idea, one concept, and apply it, what would you think it would be?
I'd say, make time for laughter. Take it seriously. Think about what makes you laugh, who makes you laugh. Do those things. And that's, that you'll feel better for it, and you'll have closer friends.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that's completely true. Thanks so much for your time today. I completely agree with the core of your message, and I think that's what I really want to speak to you about it, because it's something that I try to make clear amongst my friends. Like, we gotta laugh through it. I think these things are happening. And the world is full of tension. It's full of a lot of there's a lot of like stress. But I think a way to overcome that and connect that social connection to be strong again is that we laugh through it and we kind of stay with each other through it. So thank you for the time today.
Pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so guys. Until next time. Peace.